February 19, 2010, started like any other day for the small construction crew assigned to renovate a century-old home on the outskirts of Williamsburg, Virginia. The house had been empty for nearly a decade, its wooden floors creaking with every step, the wallpaper faded and peeling, and the air thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. Most of the crew were eager to get the renovations underway, unaware that what awaited them behind the walls would shake the local community to its core. Among the crew was a man named Mark Hensley, 28, a local carpenter who had spent years restoring historic homes. As he carefully removed the rotting drywall from a corner of the living room, he noticed something strange. The plaster behind one section of wall was unusually thick, and the brickwork seemed newer than the surrounding structure. Initially, he thought it might have been a patch from a previous renovation, but a closer look revealed a hollow space, something deliberately concealed. With a hammer and chisel, Mark began to break through the bricks, unaware that what he was about to uncover would reopen a case that had haunted law enforcement for over a decade. As the final bricks came loose, his crowbar struck something solid beneath the dust and mortar. At first, he thought it might be a bag of tools left behind, but as he pulled away the debris, he saw the unmistakable outline of human bones. Panic set in immediately. Mark stepped back, heart racing, and called over his colleague, Janet Riley, who had been sorting old timbers nearby. "Janet, I think we've found, I don't know, a body," he stammered. The two stood frozen, staring at the partially exposed upper torso of a male skeleton, carefully concealed behind the wall decades ago. Janet instinctively pulled out her phone, dialing 911, her hands trembling. The call brought Detective Sean McAllister to the scene. McAllister had spent nearly 20 years in the Williamsburg Police Department, and in his time, he had seen cases ranging from petty theft to violent crime, but nothing could have prepared him for the discovery behind this unassuming wall. Arriving at the scene, he took in the small living room, the dust motes dancing in the cold February light, and the exposed remains. He knelt down, examining the positioning of the bones, the way they had been carefully hidden. It was clear someone had gone to great lengths to ensure they would never be found. Preliminary analysis indicated the remains were not recent. Forensic experts estimated the bones had been there for roughly 13 years, dating the death back to the late 1990s. As McAllister dug deeper into missing persons records from that period, one case caught his attention immediately. A young man, 28 at the time, who had enlisted in the Army in 1997 and vanished without a trace shortly after completing basic training. The boy's family had reported him missing months later, fearing he had simply chosen to disappear. But now, after more than a decade, it seemed the worst fears were true. The discovery reopened old wounds. The man's parents, now older, had spent years holding on to hope that their son would walk through the door one day. Detective McAllister knew he had to proceed carefully, both to preserve the evidence and to handle the family's renewed grief with sensitivity. Forensic teams were brought in to carefully extract the remains from behind the wall. Every fragment of bone, every piece of mortar, was catalogued meticulously. It was painstaking work, requiring both patience and precision. While examining the scene, McAllister also began considering the property itself. The house had changed hands multiple times since the disappearance, but records showed that in 1997, it had been owned by a man named Thomas Radcliffe, a contractor with a checkered past and a reputation for aggressive business dealings. Curious connections began to emerge. Radcliffe had been in partnership with another local builder who had also vanished around the same time, another unexplained disappearance that had never been solved. The detective couldn't help but wonder if these events were connected, or if they were merely tragic coincidences. News of the discovery spread quickly through Williamsburg. Local media outlets ran stories of the hidden body behind the wall, and residents began digging through old rumors, trying to piece together the puzzle of the vanished Army recruit. Yet despite the growing attention, no new leads emerged immediately. The case had gone cold for over a decade, and anyone who might have had knowledge of the crime was either long gone or unwilling to speak. One of the more haunting aspects of the investigation was the lack of clues about the last moments of the young man's life. Friends from basic training recalled that he had been eager, disciplined, and quiet, hardly the type to vanish without leaving a trace. Letters and phone records were scoured, but nothing suggested he had planned to disappear voluntarily. In fact, everything pointed toward foul play. The methodical way the remains had been hidden suggested premeditation, yet no confession, note, or witness had ever come forward. By mid-March, forensic teams had completed a preliminary examination. The upper portion of the skeleton had survived intact, providing critical clues for identification. Dental records confirmed the identity of the young man, bringing a mixture of closure and heartbreak to his surviving family. His mother, in particular, was overwhelmed, having lived all those years without knowing what had truly happened to her son. The detective made sure she was informed in person, a private meeting that lasted hours, with tears, silence, and quiet reflection. McAllister knew that finding the remains was only the beginning. To understand what had happened, he would have to reconstruct a timeline stretching back 13 years. This meant examining every facet of the young man's life, from his decision to enlist to the moments he was last seen alive. It also meant digging into the background of anyone who might have had a motive to harm him, a process that required patience, skill, and a measure of intuition. As weeks passed, McAllister uncovered small but significant details. Neighbors who had lived near the property in 1997 recalled seeing the Radcliffe family acting strangely, avoiding eye contact, and making hurried trips in and out of town. One retired postal worker remembered a heated argument in the driveway one afternoon, but could not identify the participants. These fragments of memory were vague, yet when pieced together with property records and timelines, patterns began to emerge. Patterns that suggested the young man's disappearance was not random, but part of something calculated. The detective also began considering the broader picture. The other vanished contractor from 1997, whose records had been forgotten over time, seemed to have a suspicious overlap with the house's renovation work. Ground-penetrating radar was called in to scan the property, particularly the basement and surrounding yard, revealing anomalies buried beneath the floorboards and in the soil outside. Every discovery added layers of complexity to the case, hinting at secrets that had been deliberately concealed for years. Yet, despite these clues, McAllister faced an enduring frustration. No one could provide definitive answers about the events leading up to the Army recruit's disappearance. Witnesses were scarce, memories had faded, and anyone with direct knowledge was either deceased or unreachable. The detective was forced to rely on forensic evidence, property records, and painstakingly pieced together witness accounts to reconstruct a timeline that spanned over a decade. Then, in late April, a breakthrough occurred. While reviewing old surveillance footage from a local hardware store, a rare gem preserved on tape from 1997, McAllister noticed a familiar face entering the store multiple times in the months before the disappearance. The individual carried building materials in quantities unusual for a homeowner, suggesting a connection to the property renovations. The detective's pulse quickened. Could this lead finally point to someone responsible? Or was it another dead end in a case that had already left too many questions unanswered? The footage provided a tantalizing clue but no answers, and as McAllister prepared to dive deeper into the suspect's history, he was acutely aware of the stakes. The family had waited 13 years for justice, and the community demanded closure. Every lead, every piece of evidence, became a potential key to unlocking a truth that had been buried, literally, behind a wall for over a decade. And just as he was about to cross-reference the footage with property ownership and employee records, a discovery in the basement of the house would send the investigation into uncharted territory, revealing that what lay behind the walls was only the beginning of a far more disturbing story. Detective Sean McAllister returned to the property a few days after reviewing the hardware store footage, determined to examine every inch of the house. The exterior, though weathered, showed signs of meticulous care. The interior, however, revealed hidden corners, decaying wood, and dust-laden spaces that whispered secrets long ignored. His attention was drawn to the basement, a narrow, low-ceilinged area that smelled of damp earth and mold. It was here, he felt, that the story might finally begin to unfold. The basement had been partially renovated in the late 1990s, with some walls patched and floors reinforced. Using portable lights, McAllister and the forensic team swept every surface, scanning the ground with metal detectors and specialized equipment. At first, the search seemed fruitless. But then, beneath a section of the floor that had been replaced decades earlier, the team uncovered a subtle depression in the soil. With gloved hands and careful precision, they began to excavate. Every shovel of dirt revealed fragments of materials, old nails, and remnants of what appeared to be a wooden crate. Then, there it was, a small section of skeletal remains, partially covered by broken floorboards. Unlike the upper body previously discovered behind the wall, these bones appeared to belong to a different individual. The team immediately called McAllister over, his instincts telling him that this discovery could change the entire direction of the investigation. It wasn't just the discovery itself that was significant, it was how meticulously the remains had been hidden. Whoever had placed them there had planned for them to remain undisturbed for years. The bones were arranged in a shallow pit, wrapped in remnants of fabric that had long since deteriorated, and partially covered by bricks and debris. The care and planning involved suggested an organized and deliberate act, not a crime of opportunity. Meanwhile, McAllister continued to cross-reference property records from the late 1990s. The house had changed ownership multiple times, but it was clear that in 1997, the property had been managed by Thomas Radcliffe, the same man connected to the initial disappearance. Digging deeper, McAllister discovered that Radcliffe had a history of disputes with several young men in the construction and renovation trades, men who had worked for him, questioned him, or stumbled upon information he didn't want revealed. Each case had faded from public memory, leaving gaps in the timeline of missing persons that now appeared eerily interconnected. As the forensic team carefully extracted the basement remains, McAllister began reviewing old Army records for the vanished recruit. The young man had been a white male, 28 years old, recently enlisted, and described by friends as disciplined, polite, and unassuming. There were no indications that he had planned to disappear or leave behind his family. He had left basic training with high marks and had been temporarily assigned to a local National Guard unit near Williamsburg before vanishing. The deeper McAllister delved, the more it seemed the disappearance was tied to something far more sinister than anyone had imagined at the time. In mid-March, forensic analysis confirmed the grim reality. The basement remains belonged to another young man who had disappeared around the same period. Though the identity could not yet be confirmed, the team noted striking similarities to the previous case. Both individuals had vanished without warning, both had ties to the construction industry in Williamsburg, and both had seemingly stumbled into circumstances that would cost them their lives. McAllister knew that uncovering the connection between these cases was critical. He began reconstructing the timeline. The Army recruit disappeared in 1997, while the other young man had vanished within months of the first case. Both had connections to Radcliffe, both had been involved in renovations or building work, and both had been in locations under Radcliffe's supervision. The pattern was unmistakable. Whoever was responsible had targeted young men they considered vulnerable, men who worked in isolated locations or handled tasks that could expose secrets. Neighbors who lived near the property during the late 1990s were interviewed once again. One elderly woman recalled seeing Radcliffe carrying large containers into the basement on several occasions, often late at night, though she assumed they were supplies or scrap materials. Another neighbor remembered seeing a young man, unfamiliar to the community, helping Radcliffe with repairs, who then simply vanished without explanation. These small recollections, once dismissed as inconsequential, now formed a chilling tapestry of deliberate concealment and carefully orchestrated crimes. Adding another layer of complexity, McAllister discovered that Radcliffe had been involved in a series of legal disputes over property development. Contracts, unpaid wages, and disagreements with business partners painted a portrait of a man with both motive and opportunity. But proving his direct involvement in these disappearances required far more than circumstantial evidence. The detective needed tangible proof, confessions, eyewitness accounts, or forensic links that could withstand scrutiny in court. In April, the forensic team identified a key clue. A fragment of a handwritten note, partially decomposed, was found with the basement remains. Though damaged, some words were still legible, hinting at a personal grievance and a threat directed towards someone who knew too much. It wasn't signed, but the style of writing and choice of words bore striking resemblance to documents linked to Radcliffe from prior legal disputes. McAllister realized that even a single sentence from over a decade ago could now serve as a critical piece of the puzzle. Yet, for all the clues and evidence, a critical question remained unanswered. Why had the Army recruit, a young man with no enemies and a promising future, been targeted? Investigators considered several theories. Perhaps he had discovered the earlier disappearance while assisting with renovations, or perhaps he had stumbled onto something that someone wanted to remain hidden. Whatever the reason, the evidence suggested that his death had been deliberate, carefully planned, and executed to avoid detection. As spring turned to early summer, McAllister and his team worked tirelessly to trace the connections between Radcliffe, the property, and the missing men. Legal documents, bank records, and employee logs were painstakingly reviewed, each new detail feeding into a growing narrative of manipulation, concealment, and violence. Yet the most significant breakthroughs often came from unexpected sources: a retired delivery driver who remembered unusual trips to the property, an old neighbor who recalled conversations about renovation work, and even fragments of old photographs showing men whose faces had long been forgotten. Then, a breakthrough arrived in the form of DNA testing. By comparing samples from the basement remains with surviving family members, forensic experts confirmed that the second set of bones belonged to a man who had vanished in 1998, another young worker linked to Radcliffe's projects. The revelation was staggering. Two men disappeared within months of each other, buried in carefully concealed locations on the same property. The implications were terrifying. Someone had been systematically targeting young men, hiding the evidence, and evading justice for over a decade. Even as McAllister pieced together these grim facts, the investigation remained shrouded in uncertainty. The perpetrator's identity was still unconfirmed, and witnesses from that era were scarce. The detective knew that finding definitive proof would require digging deeper into Radcliffe's associates, employees, and personal history. But the mounting evidence painted a clear pattern. The Army recruit's disappearance was no accident, and the basement discovery had only scratched the surface of a far more disturbing truth. And just as McAllister prepared to confront Radcliffe's former business partner, someone who might hold the missing pieces of this puzzle, the detective received an anonymous tip. A voice, trembling and cautious, promised to reveal details about everything that happened behind those walls. The call ended abruptly, leaving McAllister with a tantalizing but dangerous lead. One thing was certain: the story of the vanished Army recruit and the hidden remains was far from over, and the next revelation would push the investigation into an entirely new and perilous direction. The anonymous tip came on a humid July morning. Detective Sean McAllister answered the call in his office, heart pounding. The voice on the other end was distorted, hurried, and tense. "You need to look in the shed behind the old Radcliffe property on Cherrywood Lane," it said. Everything starts there. You'll find proof of what happened to him, and the others." The line went dead before McAllister could ask any questions. Though cautious, the detective couldn't ignore it. The tip matched the timing and locations of the other disappearances, and the specificity of the shed suggested someone with direct knowledge. McAllister quickly assembled a small team, including forensic experts, and drove to the property. The house had been abandoned for years, windows boarded up, paint peeling, the air around it heavy with the scent of decay. The shed sat at the back of the property, partially hidden by overgrown brush, its wooden walls sagging under the weight of time. Inside, the team found signs of long-forgotten activity. Rusted tools littered the floor, and an old workbench was covered with dust and cobwebs. But then McAllister's eye caught something unusual. Beneath a false panel along one wall, a collection of files and envelopes had been carefully hidden. They were yellowed and brittle but intact, documents that appeared to detail renovations, finances, and property transfers involving Radcliffe. More importantly, there were notes, receipts, and photographs connecting the house to the two missing men and the vanished army recruit. Each piece of evidence revealed meticulous planning. One photograph showed the recruit assisting with renovations in the very room where his remains would later be concealed. Another depicted the second missing man near the basement area, smiling at the camera, unaware of the fate awaiting him. Handwritten notes referenced dealing with problems quietly and ensuring no witnesses remain. It was a chilling confirmation. These disappearances had been deliberate, calculated acts designed to silence anyone who might uncover the truth. As the team catalogued the files, McAllister realized he was uncovering a timeline of crimes that stretched across years, carefully documented by someone who believed no one would ever see it. But why now? Why had the anonymous caller come forward after so many years? The detective couldn't know, but he felt a renewed sense of urgency. If these documents could lead to a living perpetrator, justice might finally be within reach. Over the next few weeks, McAllister meticulously pieced together the narrative. Thomas Radcliffe, the property owner and contractor, had cultivated a network of employees and young workers, many eager to gain experience in construction. He used the guise of employment to manipulate and control, ensuring his victims were isolated and vulnerable. When one of them discovered information Radcliffe wanted hidden, such as previous disappearances or financial misconduct, they were never seen again. Their bodies were buried in hidden locations on his properties, sealed behind walls or beneath floorboards, intended to remain undiscovered indefinitely. One of the most shocking elements of the case was the army recruit himself. Assigned temporarily to work on renovations while awaiting a posting, he had unknowingly stumbled across evidence of the first disappearance. Realizing he had learned too much, Radcliffe acted swiftly, eliminating the recruit and concealing him behind the living room wall. The subsequent victims, connected by employment or chance, met similar fates, each carefully hidden in ways designed to evade detection for decades. McAllister's investigation took a decisive turn when he located and interviewed Radcliffe's former business partner, a man named Greg Lansing. Lansing, hesitant at first, eventually disclosed critical details. He admitted that Radcliffe had been obsessed with maintaining control over his projects and would go to extreme lengths to protect secrets that could ruin him. Though Lansing claimed he had never witnessed the murders directly, he confirmed that Radcliffe had previously spoken of removing problems permanently, and had displayed unusually defensive behavior toward employees who questioned his actions. With the combination of physical evidence, historical documentation, witness accounts, and forensic confirmation of the remains, McAllister sought a warrant to arrest Radcliffe. By the time law enforcement arrived at his modest home on a quiet street near Williamsburg, Radcliffe appeared calm, almost expectant. The arrest was swift and uneventful, but it marked the beginning of the end for a man who had eluded justice for over a decade. During the preliminary interrogation, Radcliffe maintained a careful silence, refusing to answer questions without his lawyer present. However, as forensic evidence mounted and the basement documents were presented, cracks began to appear in his composure. Investigators confronted him with the photographs, notes, and the 2 sets of remains. Radcliffe's lawyer attempted to shield him, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Every document, every forensic link, every witness statement painted an inescapable picture. Radcliffe had systematically eliminated anyone who posed a threat to his control or exposed his previous crimes. The trial began in January 2011. It drew national attention, a case study in cold-blooded calculation and decades-long concealment. Prosecutors laid out the timeline of disappearances, meticulously connecting Radcliffe to each crime. Witnesses testified about suspicious behavior, threats, and patterns of manipulation. Forensic experts presented evidence linking the recovered remains to the victims and demonstrating the deliberate methods of concealment. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation, as families of the victims listened to the details of their loved ones' tragic final days. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. Radcliffe was found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to consecutive life terms without parole, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. Though justice had been served, the community remained haunted by the calculated cruelty of his actions and the years lost searching for the missing men. In the aftermath, the families struggled to find closure. The Army recruit's mother held a long-delayed memorial service, placing flowers at the site where his remains had been found. The other families did the same, honoring the memories of the young men whose lives had been stolen. The house and shed where the remains were discovered were eventually demolished, leaving only a vacant lot, a quiet reminder of the darkness that had once thrived there. Detective McAllister retired a few years later, carrying the weight of the case with him. Though the investigation was resolved, it served as a constant reminder of the lengths to which some individuals would go to conceal their crimes. He continued to visit the graves of the victims, finding solace in the knowledge that justice had been delivered, even if belatedly. The story of the Army recruit who vanished in 1997, and the hidden remains discovered in 2010, remains a chilling testament to the dangers of misplaced trust and the resilience of those who pursue truth. Though years had passed, the discovery behind a simple wall revealed a calculated and deliberate series of acts, demonstrating that even the most carefully hidden secrets can eventually come to light. The case remains a stark reminder. In some homes, the walls don't just hold memories, they can also conceal darkness that refuses to remain buried forever. The real question that kept the neighborhood thinking is, could someone else have been involved, or was it all the work of one person? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more chilling true crime stories like this, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps keep these stories alive.